All right, and we're live. We had a few little audio technical difficulties, but now we can hear each other, and hopefully you can hear me as well for everyone who has joined in. I am Carole Mahoney. I'm the founder of Unbound Growth, and I am super thrilled to be joined by Jennifer Fondrevay. Am I saying your last name right, Jennifer?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Listen, that's the least of our worries.
I always want to be sure of that. Jennifer, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're famous for, and what you love to do on a day-to-day basis.
Oh my gosh, no one's ever asked me what I'm famous for. I don't think I'm famous yet, but if I were to make it up, I would have loved to have been a Broadway singer, but I am now I'm now best known for being the former chief marketing officer who wrote a book about mergers and acquisitions, a survivor's handbook. And who now works in mergers and acquisitions, a space I never thought that I would be in, by the way, to help companies, Fortune 500 and middle market on mergers and acquisitions. But I focus uniquely on the leadership aspect because, as you and I have chatted before, it's different leadership toolkit that you need when trying to navigate a merger or an acquisition for your company. So I don't know if I'm famous yet, Carole. I think thanks to this, you will make me famous.
You're famous to me. And I think that's really, in this case, all that matters to anyone. So for anyone who is listening in, or if you're listening to this later on either YouTube or Facebook or on LinkedIn, post a comment with what questions that you have about mergers and acquisitions. And we're going to actually even dive into this a little bit deeper and start talking about the sales impact that mergers and acquisitions have and vice versa. So to kick us off, you and I had this conversation and we came to the realization that both in sales and dealing with mergers and acquisitions, especially at the leadership level, that we're really dealing with behavioral change. But what do you see as the biggest challenge that most people don't really know about or think about when it comes to merging and acquiring another company with theirs?
Well, and I see this particularly with sales teams and individuals, and that's why I think you and we're so aligned. It's almost a bit of an identity crisis, and I don't want that to sound trite, because it's not. But of all of the individuals in a company, your sales teams, the individuals have their identity as sales, right? They're knocking it out of the park. They are killing it. That is what makes them successful salespeople. And what can happen, because there's so much change and uncertainty that comes with a merger and acquisition, there's almost a bit of an identity crisis. What do you mean? I've always been selling this way. I've been enormously successful. You make it sound as though this is great, but now we're going from selling a product I knew and love and could take apart and talk about in my sleep to now I've got to relearn. I've gone from a product to a solution sell. What the hell is that? And I saw that happen not just in my Navtech Nokia. So that's my origin story. I worked at Navtech as the head of B2B marketing. And Navtech is digital maps. Now they're ubiquitous, but they weren't back in the early 2000s, and we were acquired by Nokia. And so that's my frame of reference, because we were B2B and they were B2C. And a lot of the challenges that I saw came from how you identify as a company, as an individual, can feel like it's all called into question when you're going through a merger and acquisition.
Yeah. And I've even seen this happen in companies who have mergers and acquisitions where there is an alignment, this larger company in this space, acquires or merges with another smaller company, maybe even a competitor. They're similar lines of products or services that they have, but there's still that element of uncertainty and change that happens in the organization, both organizations, when, how do we align our branding and our messaging? And are we selling the same thing, but they go about it differently and this manager manages differently? And now we have twice the amount of salespeople. Are people going to get laid off? Like, anytime there's a change, and sometimes when it's unexpected, that it creates this fear and this anxiety. And we, as salespeople, our mental states absolutely directly impact our personal and professional lives.
Absolutely.
In a way that makes it hard for us to relate and listen to and ask good questions of people when we're in the background dealing with all of this stuff. So what do you think that is I don't want to say the one thing, but what is the impact and the differences approaches that they have on a salesperson? So you talked about the difference between B2B and B2C, but when it's not as obvious of a change, what are some things that leaders can do to make that negative impact less and create a positive environment where change is actually embraced and looked forward to?
Well, I think first and foremost, and you and I have talked about this a lot, it's the syndrome of what looks good on paper,
Mhm.
assuming that will play out automatically. And one thing that if I were to whittle it down to one thing, when I am working with leadership, CEOs, it's you have to factor into the timeline that pivot, that adjustment,
Mhm.
and set your leadership up to actually help their teams through that phase. You can actually accelerate people's ability to get from denial to acceptance, but you've got to factor that in. Too often there's an assumption that this is great, everyone's going to get excited. Like one of the most popular articles I wrote was like the top 10 things executives say and what your workforce really hears, right? And one of them is inevitably the leadership will say, now you have a greater offering, a portfolio of products to offer to your customers. But what your workforce, particularly, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, your sales
Mhm.
force hears, are you kidding me? Now I've got to try and convince my customer the thing that I used to trash and say was awful, but now it's part of a portfolio of solutions. Gosh, I'm so excited, right? So there's that. Or there's, wait, it's a portfolio of solutions. I still don't have this figured out. How do you expect me in this short period of time to turn around and now be able to sell this?
Yeah.
And so I think it's, and again, I mean, we're speeding up at work even faster now. So that lack of of understanding that piece of human psychology and factoring that in and helping your leadership to help your teams to embrace this, understand the value that they brought before and
Mhm.
how it can contribute to the future. If you aren't thinking that way, you either lose people, they physically walk out the door, or you lose them mentally. They check out because they're thinking, I don't know what to do, and I figure because it keeps changing, it's just going to keep changing, and I'll wait till it changes back to what I liked.
Yeah. Well, and this also brings me to, the state of buying today. And if you look at the number of deals and opportunities in an organization that lead to no decision, I mean, you go through the whole process, you spend the time and effort and energy to come up with a solution that works for them. And 40 to 60, even in some studies, Gartner starts starting to say 80% of deals end in no decision where buyers don't do anything. And there's a
Right.
number of reasons for that. There's the overload of information. So buyers are already overloaded with information. And here you come as a salesperson who now has a whole suite of products that you get to dump them on. And then there's the consensus, like the complexity of making a decision inside of an organization. Now we've added a couple of more products to that complexity as well. And then there's the difficulty in being able to tie features and benefits to a
Right.
value and how it's going to actually solve their problem. Like that's one of the biggest things that I see sales teams today struggle with, especially when you're in SaaS or technology and there's always new features and benefits that are coming out, is how do I take the questions that I've asked and the answers that I've gotten that are revealing their needs and tie it in a clear and concise way to the value that we offer in this particular solution. And now we've made all of that even more complex when we have a merger and acquisition happens. And like you said, plans on paper, when met with reality, don't always go the way that we think that they will. So what do you think are some signs that leaders should be looking for as they're starting to roll out a merger and acquisition that tells them that they need to start maybe either taking stock or doing something to make this a smoother transition for people? What are some of the symptoms that you see?
Well, the one, and I write about it in my chapter. It's the former rock star,
Hmm.
because too often what I saw were really sharp and talented salespeople who were rock stars start to hold back. The I would say the best way to capture it was, I've been very successful selling this product, doing it this way.
Yeah.
And now you're changing not only what I'm selling, but you're expecting me to change overnight in terms of how I sell that. And so that identity crisis, as we talked a little bit about before, is you have to not only as a leader look out for that, but you can help your team, specifically your sales team, by recognizing that they may struggle. There will be members of your team who will love it, who will be all excited for the change, who will think this is fabulous, and you don't need to worry about them. But you're going to have some amazing rock stars who have a difficult time pivoting because the metrics for success have changed.
Hmm.
And I think the more that you spend time acknowledging that, having empathy for that, saying, I understand you've had great value and have contributed in amazing ways to this company in the past, and you can in the future as well. But the metrics for success have changed, and giving clarity to how they've changed and what the expectation is, and giving as much runway as you can for that adjustment time, which I know is hard. I know every time I say that now, it's like, lady, do you know what we're dealing with? But as much as you can provide that runway for people to adjust and recognize what got you here, as Marshall Goldsmith says, what got you here won't get you there. So you need to think about, what was it that I was able to do before, and how do I evolve that to meet the needs of the company for the future? Because they still have value to contribute, but it's helping them to make that adjustment and to pivot by recognizing what those new metrics are and how they can still contribute their value against those metrics.
Yeah. One of the realities that I see happening in sales team, especially when you, like you said, you have rock stars, they've been with you for a while, understand, they have a flow and a system and how they do things. And in some cases, you might even say they're on a little bit of autopilot. And a lot of times what I see happen is that when there's any change that happens in the organization, whether in the how they're going to sell, maybe they're selling the same thing, but now we need to not be transactional about it. We need to be consultative about it because our buyers have been changed. Even in those situations, what I find is that those rock stars are sometimes rock stars because they've been there long enough. They have the great accounts. They've been, like you said, they've been doing it this way. And now suddenly things are starting to shift and change. And maybe they've been doing it this way for 10 or 15 years. And now are like, am I really at the place where I want to change? And what I find is going to be, and this is both for mergers and acquisitions or new product rollouts, or even shifting in how your sales process works, is that when we focus on the fundamentals, right, that then the shift and the changes become a lot easier to adjust to. And we're not relying on, I've got this pitch down, I've got it down for this particular product, but really going back to the basic fundamentals and making sure that we've mastered those, of actively listening and asking really good open-ended sequential questions in sales, that we can follow our buyers' cues, and that these shifts and changes become less disruptive when, as an organization, we're focused on those fundamentals and constantly challenging our team to master them more and more. I
do want to add to that, because I think that's such an important point. And when salespeople have come to me and say, like, what do I do? I said, if you look at the people who are being successful in the company now, who have made that pivot, how are they doing it? It's the same thing I say to CEOs and their leadership. Role model the behavior you expect. You can't let some people get away with it. Some people keep their old way. Everyone has to role model the behavior you expect. And so for sales leaders, I'll say, look at the people who are being successful. How are they doing that? And it's exactly as you said. They go back to the basics of, okay, how do I need to approach this sale now that it's different? Now that it's not just one product, but it's a solution sell, what does that look like? And leadership equally, again, as we keep saying, I think it's the theme of our call. You need to set your sales people up for success. Give them the tools that they need. Acknowledge the value that they had to get the company to this point, but now how they're going to leverage that and evolve that skill set in order to be able to pivot and adapt.
And as you said, we had our earlier conversation about this, that the thing that you want to really measure for and that you're striving for is the time that they get to productivity, to learn the new product, to learn the new process. We tend to underestimate how long of a learning curve it is for people to bring on some kind of a new behavior. But one of the things I encourage them to do is to don't just dump it on them, right? Break it down into small bite-sized pieces that they can start to build into their regular flow. And it's not like you're uprooting everything and they have to start from scratch. We've talked a lot about the logical things, right? Like, be the leader, be the example, breaking it down into small pieces, setting the vision for it, having a plan. But what are some of the hidden things that happen in mergers and acquisitions that maybe leadership doesn't always fully consider?
Well, it's the human psychology. I think that's our sub theme of this discussion. And one of the sales leaders, I talk about him in my book, I think he had the greatest impact in helping his team to adjust because he acknowledged and said up front, I know this is a change. This is a pivot. Some of you are going to be excited. Some of you will struggle initially because this isn't how we've done it before.
Mhm.
But I'm here as your leader. I'm adjusting and pivoting as well. But I'm excited by the new opportunities that this provides us. I think our customers have needed this for a while and we weren't able to deliver. He had that as his common message, if you will, but then he also had one-on-one conversations with each individual. What are you struggling with? What is exciting you about this? How can I support you as we go through this together? And I think that acknowledgement, that having empathy and really articulating, listen, here's what I see. I know this can be tough for some of us, but the opportunity and the upside for us is great, particularly as you and I have both talked about, right? The North Star is, what does your client need? What does your customer need?
Right.
And if you keep that front and center, then it's up to you to pivot and say, okay, how do I do what I need to do in order to deliver to our customer what they need?
Yeah.
And I think just role modeling, again, that behavior and showing empathy for what your team might be going through is a huge first step.
I think that empathy is so underestimated. The emotional side of all of this, acknowledging, some of you might be anxious, some of you might be, afraid of what these changes might mean, and acknowledging that it's okay to feel that way at first. It's normal to feel that way whenever any kind of a change comes, but it's about what is it that we're going to do next together, and being there for them, and not just holding them accountable. This is what we need you to do, but how can I help you to get there? What's going on with you right now? Where does that come from for you? And really helping them work through those emotional things about the change. I think that's one thing that we never really take into consideration in any kind of a behavioral change, is the emotions that are tied to that. It's
right. And that's the first and foremost, when I'm consulting CEOs, I talk about the identity that people have with the company, the grief you
right.
can go through when the company is changing and you
Mhm.
don't know what it's changing into. And I I always highlight salespeople in particular, more than any other group, maybe engineers, but sales in particular, their identity, it's what's made them so amazing as sales contributors. And so now you're telling them it's a different identity and they've got to put on a new coat and a new hat and think differently. You just don't do that overnight. But it's what made them such strong salespeople before. And so it's a big part of the consulting that I do, because as you said, it's what's typically glossed over,
Yep.
because M&A is such a transactionally driven event for a company. And so it's a large part. It's what's made me famous, Carole. It's that focus on the human psychology and the recognition that emotions that you're not used to feeling or expressing at work are coming up every time. It feels like there's a new change and a new thing you've got to deal with.
Yeah. And then I think you do an assessment of organizations. I do assessments of sales organization. How important do you think it is to have objective data when you're doing a merger and acquisition? Does it help with the emotional side? Is it another thing that maybe triggers emotions in people? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's always important to have the data.
Yeah.
There's always the right, left brain. How do you speak to both?
Mhm.
What I would say is critical, though, is you've got to pay attention to the data. And I always do both a qualitative and a quantitative. I push for that as much as possible, because in a merger and acquisition, the reality is the term just comes with negative baggage. People assume the worst. And so when they're filling out an assessment, they're more tempted to fill in what they think they need to write in order not to
Mhm.
jeopardize their role
Right.
or their position.
Yeah.
And so for me, the combination of both qualitative, and when I say qualitative, you can't obviously interview every single person in the company, but key stakeholders, people, key influencers within the company, really having a conversation with them to understand, where is their alignment, where is their misalignment, where might there be pain points that aren't anticipated,
Mhm.
so that you can factor that into your planning and, again, arm your leaders with how to help address those things early on. As you and I joked, right? Hope is not a strategy. You can't hope that people will just figure it out as they go along. So the more that you have that data and that assessment to be prepared and address it quickly, so that time to productivity
Right.
accelerates, that's where the data is key.
Yeah, because otherwise, without objective data, one, our own biases get in the way of things. There's that.
Right.
But to your point, to the time to productivity, if you want to be able to get your team to the place where they need to be as quickly as possible, trying to figure it out as you go is a recipe for not
Yeah.
right. Like, I don't know if you've ever cooked anything that you've never cooked before and you've had to follow the recipe, but imagine not having the recipe and trying to figure out how to make this particular thing in a time frame. I can't imagine how.
I did try that, Carol, and it's why I'm not a cook anymore. My husband does not allow me into the kitchen. So.
Yeah. That's kind of reverse.
For that reason, follow the instructions.
Yeah, exactly. But to your point, you're right about the assessment piece, in that when anyone is taking part in an assessment exercise or initiative, there's that feeling of, I need to answer this. I need to show up in this in the best way possible so that it doesn't endanger my position with the company. Right. And I think how we set those assessments up as leaders is critical. So when I'm working with the sales team, sales is very much metric driven, performance driven. And so when I have a sales team take an assessment, I'm very clear that this is not a job review. It's not a performance review. This is so that we can design training and coaching programs that will help you to bridge the gap from where you are and where you want to be. And with that, where do you want to be as an individual? Like, understanding what is the personally meaningful goals of the individuals on your team as a leader. That's going to be the thing, I think, that helps them to motivate them and understand where their roadblocks might be, but also to put this idea of an assessment in its proper context. Because if you're just doing an assessment and there's no report that they get afterwards that helps them to understand where their areas to improve are and where their strengths are, then for them, it just feels like a performance review. So I think setting it up in a way that, like you go to the doctor says, you have these symptoms, but we're going to do a test to figure out what it is that's really going on, and then prescribe a health plan for you to get healthy. That's kind of how I like to set it up with my sales teams as well, so that they don't feel that judgment and that need to give them the right answer instead of the honest answer.
Well, and you you hit on something that is critically important. So I just want to emphasize it. If you do these assessments and you collect this data and then don't do anything about it and don't change or address some of the things that percolate up, you have set up your M&A to fail. Yeah. Without a doubt, hands down. Every time I've seen that happen. And it's why I insist on making sure, as part of the planning and execution, that as things come up, you can't ignore them. Some things may come up that you're not happy about, but if you don't address them, one, the trust goes out the window. But then again, you will lose your potential rock stars, because they'll say, well, why did I bother providing feedback, giving this input, if we're just going to do it how it was already defined to be done? And it's why I also insist on one-on-one interviews, being that person who does the assessment. Yeah. I'll say, if I do focus groups, right, you want me to do just teams of people, or even if it's a mix, that rarely works, because people don't feel comfortable sharing what they're excited about and what they're concerned about in the same breath. And so I love the fact that you brought up the importance of the assessment and how you execute that assessment, and then what you do with it afterwards are as critical to the success of your deal.
Yeah. And I've also found from personal experience in working with clients that being on the outside, a third party, I have heard, like, people will say things to me that they wouldn't be able to say to their boss. And
absolutely,
as in a position that I can share with their leader, like, some people on your team are feeling this way and some people are feeling this way, without naming names. It really does help them get insight into how a leader's own attitudes and behaviors impact their team. And I think that's something that most leaders think that, do as I say, not as I do. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work with kids. It doesn't work with teams either.
No. And I know you and I both operate this way as well. I've actually literally had in meetings where some guy was like, are you a witch or something? Like, how are you reading my mind? How do you know what it is? And I said, well, it's because I've been in your shoes. I know what it's like to try and pivot and adapt when you're going through a merger and acquisition. I've been on all sides of the deal. So to your point, when you have that third party person who has the perspective and the experience, who can give you an informed view on, here's what the assessment is saying.
Yeah.
And by the way, here are things that they aren't articulating in the quantitative assessment, but which really came through in the qualitative discussions that if you don't pay attention to quickly, could really undermine the success of your deal.
Yeah.
And so having that third party perspective, not only to do the assessment, but to give you that informed view afterwards is absolutely, absolutely critical.
Yeah. I often, people will say something similar to me. Not, they haven't called me a witch yet, but they have called me a therapist.
We said witch in a nice way. It wasn't
like totally like witch vibes. Yeah. But what's interesting is that they'll share things that because you're not emotionally invested in the outcome because you're on the outside of it, right? Like your manager is somewhat emotionally invested in your success because that's how they're successful and so forth. And so there's definite value in having a third party, unopinionated, objective view to be able to deliver that data. But to your point, if you're not going to do anything with it as a leadership organization, you have immediately lost the trust of your team.
Yeah.
And having gone through, I don't know how many dozens of these types of organizational assessments, one of the things that I love hearing from leaders is that when we go through the data and I explain to them at a high level what this means and the impact that it has. I had one general manager of a company, there was like 50 salespeople, and we were with their entire executive team as we were going through this. And she stopped in the middle of everything. She's like, I want everyone here to understand this. Everything that we're seeing here is on us. We've created this. We've created the culture. We've created the systems. We've created the processes that have given us the team that is in the state that they're in now. And we need to take ownership of that and do whatever it takes to change and correct it. And for me, that was like, I wish every leader.
You were probably tempted to say, you know what, let's just close this down.
Right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, though, in the dozens of companies that I've worked with, I've only heard it a handful of times where leadership actually says that. Instead of pointing fingers and this person's not cutting it and we need to replace them, it's to really dig in to understand how did we create this situation? And only we are the ones that can actually correct it.
Yeah. And that self-awareness to know we all own this. We all own the success. Everyone's always excited and says, I had a role in that. I had a role in that. We all own every single aspect of the company's success or failure. And I love that you highlighted that, Carole, because too often what I've seen happen is the transaction, the focus on the transaction, the finance, the accounting, the legality, all of that. Once it's done, then it's like, well, HR will figure out the rest. This is not just HR owning the success of this, the people piece. We all own it. And you and I have talked throughout in this discussion, role modeling that behavior, demonstrating this is change and change is hard and everyone reacts differently to change and uncertainty. But if we continue to be there for each other, sympathetic and really listening to help us move forward so that we communicate this message in a way that everyone understands and sees the value that they can contribute to it. But that's all of us together. This isn't something that HR is now going to come out with frequently asked questions and a communications plan and, hey, here's your new benefits package. Yeah, it's got to be so much more than that. So I suspect you probably almost wanted to go over and hug this sales leader when she said it, because it's absolutely true. And I wish more leadership would have that same attitude.
Absolutely. And I think what you said was key in the self-awareness. Like we're talking about change, and mergers and acquisitions are just a very big change that's very obvious. But the very first step to managing any kind of change and behavioral change is that level of self-awareness. And I think that's where the assessments come in. That's where and then the one-to-one conversations come in, that the more aware, emotionally intelligent our leadership is, the better the culture is going to be that people are going to operate in. And you're going to find that these mergers, these acquisitions, these transitions and changes that your organization is going through, they're never going to go smoothly, but they're going to be much smoother than if you were to just try to hammer things in and hold people accountable to the numbers without giving them the resources to actually make that change happen.
Right. And it's funny, even as you were saying, because I've had more than one person say, M&A leadership, like, is that a thing? And I'll say yes, because it's a unique event in a company's journey. And as you said, it in my experience, and I've gone through digital transformation, org restructures, new leadership, But the thing with a merger or an acquisition is you've got two companies coming together and you're redoing the strategy, the process, the systems, the cultures all at once. And so it comes with its own unique set of challenges. I know this because when I've spoken at events where people haven't gone through a merger and acquisition, and they look at me like, what are you talking about? We won't have any of those problems. And afterwards, I've had it happen more than once that a leader's come back to me and said, oh my God, now I understand what you're talking about. We just went through, we just went through an acquisition, or we just went through a merger.
Yeah.
And so it's why the role of leadership is so important, and you have to adjust because it's a different set of leadership tools that you're going to use. You may not really think about empathy and compassion and helping people and the importance of self-awareness and all of that. But during this moment in time, you have to really lean into those skills because you'll help bring the team along. And frankly, it'll help you in the adjustment as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's both sides. It's not just one company. It's not just the company who's being acquired that's going through this change. Both companies are going through this drastic change at the same time. It's like, I almost feel like it's like, two people get married and they bring their set of kids in and they're all living in the same house all at once. And now suddenly day-to-day routines have changed. How we talk to each other is like everything has changed. And so that self-awareness, the mapping the change, being there, breaking it down into small chunks for people so that it isn't so overwhelming. Any final tip that you would leave for organizations who are planning a merger and acquisition that they can better prepare themselves for it?
It's a tip I give, whether it's sales, marketing, products, senior leadership, frontline leaders. To me, the core of a successful merger or an acquisition is respect. Respect for the other side, respect for the individual, not judgment, because as we've talked throughout, everyone reacts differently to change and uncertainty. And when you recognize that this is an adjustment, respecting that people are adjusting, I've said before, we've highlighted that people can go through a grieving period.
Yeah,
because it's a loss of identity. Think about it as you would never say someone who's grieving the loss of someone else, hey, hurry up. We've got to move on. You would never do that. But the going through this level of shift, there is that grieving process. And so respecting that doesn't mean you coddle people, but at the same time, when you respect and you show that respect, to me, that cascades down through the organization, through your teams, and recognizing and showing that you have respect for the other side, for the individuals of your team. It helps them feel heard and seen, and I think allows people to make those pivots and adjustments that they need to.
This will be my last question, I promise, but do you find that there's a timeline when things start to get into a smooth groove and cycle and rhythm once all of the disruption has happened?
It really varies. And it's what I would say, it's why I'm always trying to get in early, right? Before the deal is announced, to prepare your leadership for day one.
Right.
Frankly, the moment a leader thinks about a merger and acquisition, that's when change has already happened. Even if that leader thinks, if he or she thinks, well, I've told no one. Yeah, but you start to make decisions through a different lens.
Right.
And so people start to pick up on that. Rumors can circulate. Even if you haven't said anything, people can say, well, Joe's been making decisions like he doesn't usually. What do you think that means? And so I'll say to leaders, you may not have said anything, but people are already conjuring up what they think is happening. And so I always try and get in earlier because that timeline varies. But I can say the sooner than me or any human capital advisor or yourself, Carole, right? Somebody who helps you to really prepare before the announcement is made, so your leadership is set up for success. That is what helps reduce the longer timeline on the back end of people getting to productivity.
Yeah. So like worst case scenario is it's all happening behind the scenes and then suddenly it's announced to everyone and then the whole company is like, what are you talking about? What do you mean we've been acquired? That's not a good situation to find yourself in.
No.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for all of these insights. I've learned a ton, as I always do whenever we talk. And if you're listening in, make sure that you follow Jennifer both on YouTube and here on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will all see you next time.
Thanks for making me famous.
And we'll continue to make you famous.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.